Hello and welcome. You're watching the Kaleido Insights video series where we explore the impacts of COVID-19 on key themes that affect our lives as consumers, the future of businesses, and the ecosystems we're all part of. I'm Jaimy Szymanski, an industry analyst and founding partner at Kaleido Insights, and I'm joined today by my amazing business partners, Jeremiah Owyang and Jessica Groopman. We are delighted to have you here, and we hope you're staying healthy and well. The theme we'll discuss today is what we refer to as sustainability, answering the key question, how are technologies driving environmental stewardship and new business opportunities? Let's consider the future impacts in our discussion as they relate specifically to COVID-19. To kick it off, I'll pass it over to Jeremiah. Jeremiah, what are your thoughts on this, drop in carbon emissions that we're seeing?
Thank you. There's been a number of images that have come across, especially in March and April, of China and as well as northern Italy, where we saw a decrease in the amount of emissions as humans were sequestered in their homes. And across the world, everybody was thrilled that this was an opportunity for us to reduce greenhouse emissions as we are in the middle of a climate crisis. Now, it's interesting. Some of the research that has come across, I have data from Scientific American that unfortunately, it's not enough. I did poll a number of people in my network saying, guess how much emissions were reduced by people being at home. And I heard people guessing 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of global emissions. Unfortunately, it's only around 17%. Well, while that is better than zero or climbing, it's still not enough for us to make those changes. And the main issue or the reason is that the other 80%, according to a professor at Stanford, is everything else that we continue to do. We have a global supply chain. We have energy that is not being using renewable energy sources or green sources. And so we're still going about our lives, except for the personal transportation of flights and homes has been reduced. Now, with that said, there is still some good news with this. We now have, for the first time, some data on what does it take for us to reduce emissions. So we can see with the many sensors that are all around us in vehicles, air quality sensors, logistics and movement of humans and individuals. And we can now start to forecast and model out what could the world look like if we actually started to reduce this or kept it at this pace on an ongoing basis. So I see this as a data opportunity that we could use this information to create digital twins of Earth in order to model how can we actually fix the climate crisis.
It's interesting. That relates to our conversation last week a little bit about digital twins and using them in a completely different way here to model this stuff out. I think we must have been looking at similar articles based on the same study, Jeremiah. I was looking at that 17% decrease, and you touched on it too. I think it's important to bring up that just about half of that 17% decrease, though, was from surface transport. So this shows that it's temporary. It's not going to be permanent unless we, potentially travel less on a global scale. It's not because always of, shelter in place orders and whatnot. It's the transportation and trucking industry and logistics and supply chain and business travel as well.
Yeah. It's it's interesting because this is in many ways kind of the world's largest experiment in pushing pause. We have paused the rat race, and it's been slowly beginning to pick up, but also scale back as we are seeing the fits and starts of economic restart and resurgences. But while we're pushing pause, in many ways we are also changing behaviors. And a big question I have based on these data that we've been talking about and the changes in transportation is what kinds of behavioral shifts at the consumer level will then translate, from a consumption standpoint and then translate into commercial behaviors. So just taking, for example, we've seen how pausing several really critical carbon heavy activities, I'm thinking business travel, I'm thinking large commercial real estate, construction was down, I want to say 22, 25% in the past quarter. Mass commutes. I'm reporting live from the San Francisco Bay Area, one of the worst traffic areas in the world. All kinds of different things, reductions in industrial production. It's not just pushing pause, but it's also kind of fundamentally prompting all of us to ask, well, what do we actually need to conduct business travel and conduct business affairs, to, have production and inventory? How much variability, how much sort of resilience do we need in our production and supply chains that is more sort of agile rather than kind of constant? I mean, in many ways in supply chain industries, it still operates on paper. A lot of these are very inefficient processes. So this sort of ripples outwards in many different ways. And, one of the things that I see kind of near term are, from the consumer behavioral standpoint, things like video conferencing. We are now using telehealth more than we ever thought. With, ed tech is booming right now for obvious reasons. Micro fulfillment, whether it's through mobile apps or something like that, but also 3D printing. I saw an example of what used to be a scuba diving design converted into masks and then printed using 3D printers. So all of these kinds of questions about kind of what are the near-term behavioral shifts and how are new technologies supporting those behavioral shifts? My question is, will these solutions displace their more kind of carbon-hungry predecessors?
I wonder some of those behaviors are kind of ingrained though, and I'm sure we'll talk about this next week. We talk more about future of work, but
Exactly.
I'm thinking of some of the technologies that exist out there, like Spatial or Mimesys, which I think was bought by Magic Leap recently. And they create these like spatial collaboration environments using AR and VR, and it's pretty cool to be able to collaborate on this virtual plane. But if you don't have that behavior ingrained in you as how you communicate with others, again, it's similar to what we were just talking about with reduced carbon emissions. You're going to go back to the same way that your comfort zone is, unless you're forced to do elsewise.
Yeah. Now, another question I have long term, we think kind of near term, what is this going to look like? It's a moving goalpost. The situation is changing rapidly. But long term speaking, as I want to say the global number of investments and bonds and supplements and subsidies that governments are investing globally is around $7 to $8 trillion. How much of that infusion of investment will then go into green tech? Will go into jobs, will go into carbon capture technology. This also remains to be seen. To what extent will economic recovery run parallel to some of the green tech investments that we've been needing to make for a long time, but have not sort of had the impetus to do so, or that event? Perhaps this is it. Perhaps not.
That's, talk about some of the investments. I was looking at some other technologies. I mean, the idea of ride sharing via autonomous vehicles has excited me for years. And I think like this is like the moment for it, right? As we understand that, transport has been decreased drastically. People are used to not driving the way it is. It's giving way to green space in cities. But you make a great point, Jess, in terms of what are those core investment shifts that need to happen, though. Things just like making sure that autonomous vehicles have low fuel consumption and economy. I was looking at a couple of different studies. One was from the University of Michigan that talks about congestion and the differences that we'll see before and after COVID, and if autonomous vehicles are actually going to be brought to light. And it still comes down to the fact that if they're not fuel efficient, that doesn't matter anyway. Like they see no forecasting to say that it will make any impact if we don't get some of these core technologies down. And I think that's a great reality check, especially for us as analysts. We like to see what's new and hot and interesting and get excited about the future 5-10 years down the road. But we're still solving for some of these core issues in transportation that need to be fixed first to see this long-lasting reduction in carbon emissions.
Additionally to that, thank you for bringing up transportation. This is an area that I'm very passionate about, is that we might see people continue to want to use their own cars rather than physical trains, shared spaces, and or buses for those that can afford it. So we're going to see more reliance on car culture for those that end up commuting, which I don't think it will be the entire workforce, but that is a concern and that we need to be thinking about. So perhaps that we develop new types of tools that enable us to smooth out the commute, or people come in at different times so we can have less people idling on the freeways. So that's a good use of a logistics-based technology being applied to people in their cars.
Yeah, it reminds me of what we were talking about just last week, though, too, about, maybe people will be more likely to get back to using trains and buses if they know that they have UV lights installed that are, killing all the germs. That'd make me much more comfortable with going back to public transport. It's cool, too, to kind of think about, well, what else this will give away to new behaviors with, autonomous vehicles, for example, too, just kind of, thinking about that a little more. And some of the opportunities that we've discussed in other episodes about roaming retail, for example, but you could expand that to even roaming medical care, right? You have an ailment and you need to be, scanned for something, blood taken. You could get into an autonomous vehicle that's driving around a nurse practitioner, or even done by robotics, and get that taken care of right away. And that would also reduce a lot of the congestion that we see. And the retail opportunities are just abound in that. A few different tangential technologies need to get up to speed, 5G in particular, but those are some exciting things that we could see as well, based on just the fact that there's going to be less congestion and people less willing to travel out of their homes for things immediately.
Yeah. It's a great reshuffling. I mean, it's a great, the World Economic Forum is calling this sort of proverbial moment the Great Reset. And in some ways, that's kind of this question of, wow, back to nature, back to basics. We see just how subject we are to the forces of nature. But also the Great Reset in terms of what we're talking about with the technologies being accelerated, with new investments, with just sort of asking ourselves, what do we actually need to do? And what do we need to consume? What do we want to consume? There's a real potential anyway for this sort of major recalibration in how we think about our consumption and the role of technology as well.
There's also another risk here too. As people work from home, they're reliant upon the energy production from whatever their gas and electric might be, versus many modern businesses are installing renewable, specifically solar, at their locations. So we might actually be increasing the carbon emissions by working from home if we're not set up at the home in the right way. I haven't seen any real definitive studies on that, but I think that's something we need to watch and how technology can make a play in that.
Absolutely.
That's true too. I mean, I was thinking about something else too. I was curious what your guys' thoughts were. I know that Jeremiah, you know a lot about modern wellness and modern well-being, and there are a lot of self-tracking apps that are out there about your own carbon footprint, your carbon emission. Do you think that things like that will rise based on similar trends you've seen in modern well-being?
That's great. Yes, there are calculators to determine your carbon footprint, and a lot of it is dependent upon things. It depends on the calculator. So if it's around, are you eating locally and are you walking and biking instead of driving? How are you flying to Europe and back, especially in business class? Then you're polluting far more than other people. But it also comes down to where are your products from? Like, are you purchasing goods that are made in China, assembled in South Africa, then sent back to China, then sent back to America? And then assembled somewhere else, right? And that's an issue, and we don't always have full visibility into it. So it's a complex thing to do, but I think we just go back to the basics of only trying to use what we really need, and then sharing that at a local level. But that's sometimes independent of technology. So I have yet to see that be tracked in a way that could be some type of carbon calculator taking all of that into account. I suppose Amazon could actually do that, but that would probably be in their disinterest.
Right. I mean, I'm sure, Jess, your brain is also going right now thinking about blockchain in all of this, and blockchain's ability to track the provenance of goods.
Indeed.
And that could be a missing link to a lot of what you just said, Jeremiah.
We wonder, I mean, the question and the role of blockchain in supply chain and product transparency and provenance, a huge question. And also sort of the carbon trading economy, such as it is. It's very difficult to measure this. And, I always think of standards when we talk about blockchain too, which are globally lacking. Another point I would make on coronavirus and climate, speaking of standards, is the need. These are systemic risks. These are systemic risks that no one country, or the actions of any one country cannot necessarily serve the greater resilience. We can't protect. Whatever the United States doesn't preclude the rest of the world from the impacts of climate change or coronavirus or AI risks for that matter. I mean, there are so many different kind of technology and climate, ecological, and natural risks that are systemic, that require kind of multilateral coordination, collaboration to safeguard ourselves and build new systems around this. Still lacking today, but we hope that it is a reset and a push towards greater collaboration.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this has been a really great discussion today,
Fantastic.
guys. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jeremiah, for your very insightful contributions, as always. You can learn more about Kaleido Insights sustainability coverage and our other research themes on our website, kaleidoinsights.com. And join us next time for our last installment of this series as we continue to analyze how COVID-19 will impact the future of work. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.